Great. I think we're live. All right. I'd like to welcome everyone to our seminar today, looking at Tasmania's opportunity in the national electricity market transformation. My name is Dylan McConnell. I'm a research fellow here at the Climate and Energy College. Before we get started, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners. Please join me in acknowledging the traditional owners of the various lands from which we're all meeting here today, and pay their respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And so this seminar today is being hosted by the Climate and Energy College and the Energy Transition Hub, and it is being recorded, and that video will be made available on our websites after the event, hopefully later on today. As usual, we'll hear our presentation from our speaker and then have question and answer afterwards. We would ask you to put your questions in the Q&A part of the Zoom function rather than the chat box, please. Submit. You can upvote questions in that Q&A feature, and we'll get to those and hopefully unmute you and get you to actually ask the questions yourself during the Q&A time. Now, before we get started today, we're going to hear about Battery of the Nation, the Tasmanian the project down from Hydro Tasmania, as you know, those of you that are following the energy transition in Australia would have probably noticed there's quite a bit of talk about Marinus Link in the recent integrated system plan from the Australian Energy Market Operator. It's, I guess, separate but related to the Battery of the Nation project. In fact, yesterday, if you missed this in the colour and noise about the gas announcement, that's probably understandable. But the federal government also put through a program of about $250 million to look at some of these transmission upgrades to various parts of the country, including Marinus Link, which is a transmission link between Tasmania and Victoria. Even though they're sort of separate, they're related to the Battery of the Nation project, which we'll hear more about today from Chris Gwynne. And Chris manages the strategic development of the Battery of the Nation project, which is, you know, the blueprint for Hydro Tasmania's energy resources. He's an electrical engineer by profession and has spent the last 15 years working across a full spectrum of Hydro Tasmania's activities and transactions such as the transfer of the Aurora's gas operations to Hydro Tas in 2013. Anyway, without further ado, I'll hand over to Chris, who will give us a rundown of the project. All right, great. Thanks, Chris.
No worries. Thanks, Dylan. Before I kick into it, I'll just acknowledge there's two other of my colleagues that are here as well as part of the panel. Cam Crawford, who is my strategic stakeholder engagement manager. So you can imagine there's a lot of stakeholder engagement that goes on with a project like this. And I've got Pippa Williams, who up until recently was directly in my team and providing a lot of the intellectual horsepower behind some of the analysis that we've done. And whilst she's moved on to do a few other things in the business, she's still very closely connected to the project. So I'll try and answer as many questions as I can, but if they start to get really complex, I've got a very, very strong backup plan, and that's Pippa. So welcome Pippa as well. I'll just share my screen, everyone, and we'll see if I can get this to work. So, can anyone tell me that they can see the beautiful picture of Lake Murchison on their screen?
Yep, I can see it.
Oh, perfect. Cool. I'm slowly getting my handle around the technology in doing these webinars. Look, I'll try to spend about 45 minutes on the presentation and then leave a good chunk of time for Q&A at the back end. It's important to try and understand, I guess, the connections between what is Marinus Link and Battery of the Nation, and they all sort of get thrown together quite often. Look, you know, Marinus Link is the project that's assessing the viability of more interconnection between Tasmania and Victoria. So, you know, specifically, it's looking at a proposal for 2 new 750 megawatt links between the two regions. And it's been run by Tas Networks, and it's currently undergoing a RIT assessment at the moment. So Battery of the Nation, in a sense, really, I guess, describes Hydro Tasmania's response to that sort of investment in the market. So it's really focused on I guess, the power of the current hydropower system here in Tasmania, and what sort of role it could play, what sort of expanded role it could play in the broader market. The further we get into this transition to more variable renewable energy. So Battery of the Nation is really around how the existing hydropower scheme could be utilised, but also it looks at the opportunity to develop pumped hydro assets within the existing schemes as well. So I'll try and focus on, I guess, that market opportunity. So certainly the market opportunity for Hydro Tasmania, but more broadly, why would the market be interested in these sorts of developments? And it really hinges off the idea that if you can bring the Tasmanian hydropower system closer to the rest of the market, which is essentially what interconnection allows you to do, you've got a great big existing storage asset. You've got the water in storage already. You've got about a 2,400 megawatt sort of capacity machine spread all over the state. And you've got the opportunity to actually utilise that water in those existing storages to build really cost competitive pumped hydro. So it's the opportunity for the market to be able to access existing storage and capacity, but also to access new storage and capacity through a pumped hydro development here in Tasmania. And particularly as we get further into this transition, and we're really looking at sort of the late 2020s onwards, if you look at the sort of the ISP dates for Marinus, it's those points in time where we're starting to get much more significant, I guess, increasing levels of penetration of wind and solar, and they'll start to dominate. And it's really when the market will then need longer duration storages to support that sort of energy mix. So that's effectively what the Battery of the Nation concept is all about, and I'll try and focus most of my conversation on that today. But sometimes you can't help but drift into the Tas Networks or the Marinus Link discussion. But I'll try and call that out as much as I can because it's obviously a separate project. You also can't talk about Marinus Link and Battery of the Nation without talking about the wind resource that's here in Tasmania, and how it would respond in terms of increased wind development here in Tasmania with more interconnection, and what that effectively means as well in terms of the Battery of the Nation opportunity. Because clearly, if you want to utilise this hydropower system down here to perform a different role of the market in the future, we need to be relieved somewhat of I guess our current role here in Tasmania, which is effectively keeping the lights on. And interconnection actually triggers that sort of new renewable energy investment, not just here in Tasmania, but also in Victoria, which unlocks that storage and capacity opportunity that is Battery of the Nation. So they're the three pieces that all move together. And as I said, I'll try and focus on the Battery of the Nation bit and the value of storage in the current system, as well as any pumped hydro projects we're looking at. But we'll probably drift into some of those other topics as we move through. So there's lots of moving pieces here at the moment. So, I think Dylan mentioned earlier the call out for Marinus Link in the 2020 ISP. So that was a really, really important release, I think, for Marinus Link, but also for Battery of the Nation, because, AEMO as the market planner is pointing to the likely need of Marinus Link into the future. It's just a matter of what's the optimum timing for that investment. And clearly, because of the uncertainty we've got in the market over a range of different factors, they're taking a very astute, I think, scenario approach in terms of what options do we need available as the market to be prepared for the change that's coming. So in the ISP, it calls out the two cables for Marinus Link. The first cable being needed as early as 28, 29, and the second cable being needed as early as 31, 32. So really, if you look at, that's 10 years down the track, you'd expect there's going to be increasing levels of renewables penetration in the system. We'll start to need increasingly longer duration storages in the system to maintain reliability and security. And effectively, that's where some of these attributes for Hydro Tasmania and our current assets come into play. It's important to note the ISP did call out decision rules around Marinus Link. So one of the important ones is obviously the cost allocation framework, or who pays for it. And I won't get into that too much today. It's really an issue that's being dealt with by others, but clearly there's an issue with the Marinus Link project, in the sense that from a RIP-T perspective, most of the benefits turn up on the northern end of the cable. So there needs to be due consideration of what the cost allocation mechanism for this investment would be. So on the basis that the cost benefit analysis actually makes sense from market's perspective, then the secondary question that needs to be resolved before you'd pull the trigger on a project like that is the cost allocation framework. So clearly a really important part, and it's good to call it out early in any presentations we do on any of this stuff. The Tasmanian Renewable Energy Action Plan was also released a couple of months ago in draft for consultation. So, clearly an investment like Marinus, further investment in hydropower in Tasmania and significant wind development is a massive change, not just for the energy industry in Tasmania, but more broadly for the Tasmanian economy. It's a big development opportunity for the whole state. And the state government needs to play quite a strong role in I guess, setting up the right frameworks to ensure that we get sensible development in the state. So, you start to see the state government down here starting to get a lot more active in terms of trying to provide those sorts of, I guess, coordination and facilitation roles to the industry, but more broadly across the Tasmanian community. I'll talk a bit about the next phase of the development process post the ISP. And importantly, we're getting close to selecting our preferred pumped hydro site for future development. So we've been looking at a number of sites, and we're looking to choose one site in the next couple of months that we would take forward. And importantly, that site would be lined up for the second cable. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we move through the slides. So this is a good, I guess, summary of the Hydro Tasmania response to more interconnections. So currently we have a hydropower system in Tasmania that's around 2,400 megawatts of capacity. So we have a system, and we sort of describe it as being an energy constrained system, not a capacity constrained system. So what that means is we have more capacity in our system than we ever need at one point in time. So maximum light in Tasmania, which is on a very cold winter's morning for a very short period of time, will be about 1,800 megawatts. But normally it sort of sits around the 1,200 or 1,300 megawatt range. So the reason why we have a lot of excess capacity in the scheme is because the hydropower schemes in Tasmania over a century were designed to capture the energy. So to capture the energy, you essentially had to overbuild the capacity. In the way we run at the moment, where we just have one Basslink interconnector, Hydro Tasmania still performs that role of energy security to a large degree. So, the hydropower system, in terms of the water we have in storages, is a really, really critical. It's probably the most critical factor when you look at energy security for Tasmania. The opportunity with more interconnection is that more interconnection brings more sources of new energy. So, that could be wind development in Tasmania, and it could be solar development in Tasmania for that matter. But it'll also be wind and solar development on the mainland as well. So, and effectively that's the opportunity that comes along from more interconnection. If you have more energy, more new sources of energy available in Tasmania, the hydropower system doesn't have to be so focused on that job of keeping the lights on. And we can start to use those attributes around storage and our dispatchable capacity, provide a different set of services into the market. And it just so happens that those different sets of services, the ability to store energy and the ability to actually bring it back into the system when it's most needed, are the very attributes that are going to be really valuable in the future for the market. Because we all know that as we get increasing levels of renewable energy, we're going to get sort of almost like tidal flows of energy in the system, and storage is going to be a really, really critical part of keeping the system secure and reliable. So from a Hydro Tasmania perspective, there's sort of 4 layers to it. We've got the opportunity to use what we call existent latent capacity. So an example of that is that, and we have the case study, you can see there's from January 19, but we have these sorts of events that pretty much occur, are quite common. And that's effectively where you have a Victorian system that is under stress, and we have maximum export across Basslink of 500, let's just call it 500 for the time being. But we nearly always have around 500 megawatts of latent capacity sitting in our schemes that we could actually turn on and inject more megawatts in the system. And because they're relatively short periods of time, you know, from an energy perspective, they don't make a big dent on our storages. So that capacity sits there already, and that number actually can go a lot higher than 500. It all depends on at what point in time the market needs it and what we're doing with our assets. So there's a lot of opportunity for us to actually push that number, that 500 number higher, and have it focused around optimizing capacity when the market needs it. Because at the moment we don't have that driver in the system because we have excess capacity. The second layer, I guess, to the opportunity is there's lots of opportunities for us to rethink how we use the existing asset base. So whether that's how we manage our outages, in terms of, at the moment we manage outages based on direct costs. So because we don't have a capacity optimization driver, we don't necessarily manage our outages to optimize capacity in the market. So there's a lot of opportunity for us to change the way we do things on the existing fleet to create more capacity available to the market. The next tier down, which is the third dot point, is we also then have opportunities to actually change some of our investment decisions around investing in the current kit to actually focus on increasing capacity out of some of our power stations. And you essentially do that by changing designs of refurbishments. So be a little bit less focused on efficiency of the machines and be a little bit more focused on capacity. So the mechanical and hydropower engineers that are on the line, and I'll be very careful how deeply I go into this, but you know, there's efficiency capacity curves, and you know, you can change your designs based on what you would like to get out of your station. So there's lots of opportunities for us to do that. One of the bigger ones for us is we've got a big investment decision for the Tarraleah power scheme coming up pretty soon. So it's a scheme in our system in the Upper Derwent that was built we started building it in the 1930s, so it's a pretty old asset. We've got a choice in front of us over the next couple of years. Do we either refurbish the existing power station, which limits the amount of megawatts we can get out of the scheme, and it also limits flexibility in using the water, or do we actually decide to build a new power station and replace the old one, which would effectively more than double the number of megawatts coming out. So we get about 75, 80 megawatts out of that current scheme, and we could get over 200 out of that scheme with a new power station. But importantly, we also would have a lot more flexibility in how we use that power station, because the flexibility is just as important as the increase in megawatts. So those first three dot points, they effectively describe the Battery of the Nation response to the first Marinus Link cable. So the first cable, 750 megawatts, you know, if it came in around 28, which is sort of the number that the ISP has called out as being possibly required, we would be focusing in the first instance on those three opportunities, because they're the most cost-effective ways for us to, I guess, maximize the opportunity in terms of delivering dispatchable capacity over that next link. You don't need a significant new pumped hydro site on the back of that because of the potential that's in the existing scheme. Now, the storages are already there as well, so that's an important point to note. So, you know, our storages are built for energy, so they're built to be running machines all the time. So if you're looking to actually use a lot of these power stations for their dispatchable capacity as opposed to just baseload energy, not that I like to use the term baseload, you've got a lot of water in storage to play with. So, you know, there's no economic driver for us, or there's no driver for us to be investing in a pumped hydro site to support that first cable. It's the second cable where we start to max out that sort of latent opportunity, if you want to call it that, and we would then be looking at building around a 750 megawatt pumped hydro asset to line up with the second Marinus Link cable. And we'll look at some of the sites in a second in terms of the ones we're looking at. We'll talk a little bit more in the moment about sort of long duration or deep storage as well. So you can pretty much consider all of our existing assets as deep storage. And you can certainly, a pumped hydro site for us would be deep storage as well, because we'd be looking at sort of plus 15 or 16 hours plus of storage duration for any of our projects. So it's a really important point because, you know, there's this differentiation between I guess the storage durations that we think are going to be required in the market of the future, and how, as you sort of get further and further into the transition and have high levels of renewable penetration, you start to need longer and longer duration storages to support that sort of system. And, you know, we look at the timing of Marinus Link and these opportunities for us as being quite optimal in terms of, you know, you get to the end of the 2020s and you start to see that need starting to increase. And that's where, you know, we see certainly our hydropower system and the pumped hydro opportunities we've got as making a really useful contribution to this transition that we're starting to experience. This is the Marinus slide. So as I said, I won't get into this too much, but clearly the battery of the nation opportunity relies on more interconnection. So it's currently a project that TasNetworks are prosecuting in terms of a RIT-T. So, and it's, you know, as we said, it's been reflected in the 2020 ISP. And I don't think it's a question of whether or not it is a sensible project to be in the ISP. It's more a question on when's the optimum timing for it to be delivered. So it's a big deal for Tasmania, as you can imagine, because it'll completely change the way our system works, but also from a broader economic perspective. It'll unlock a significant amount of economic development in Tasmania. It's important to note as well, though, that the analysis that TasNetworks have done so far also points to quite a significant economic benefit for Victoria as well, in terms of the work that needs to be done on the Victorian side of the link. Now, this is a slide that we put together sort of late last year, and it's a very specific slide. For many, the whole time we've been doing this project, we always get the question, but with the cost of a $3.5 billion interconnector, how can the Tasmanian options be cost competitive? So we kept getting this question all the time, and the RIT-T doesn't necessarily answer that question. It answers a different, I guess, wider question of cost benefit for an investment like Marinus Link. So we have done some specific analysis that really looks at a hypothetical situation where if you needed to supply 750 megawatts of new firmed or shaped energy into Melbourne, and you had a number of different discrete options you could choose from, what would those cost stacks look like? So this is the analysis that we came up with. So the four top ones are sort of what you might call Vic only options, and the two ones down the bottom are the Hydro Tasmania ones. So in reality, this is not how it would work. You get a mix of those options that come into the mix, obviously. But it's a really good, simple graphic to show you the power of that hydropower system sitting behind Marinus. So the light grey area on most of the bars, that's essentially your new variable renewable energy coming in, which is obviously your wind and solar. Clearly, the top one, that's purely a gas option. But the black bar is the firming cost. So it's really, that's where the cost competitive nature of the Tasmanian development options come to play, because you get to access the existing hydropower system, and you get to access that cost competitive pumped hydro development in Tasmania. And when you're talking about, you know, the numbers of that 750 megawatts of new shaped energy, you need quite a lot of storage or gas, or for that matter, to actually supply to make it reliable. And you can see then from the thatched area for the Tasmanian options is obviously the two Marinus Link cables. And there's obviously some interconnection and transmission required for some of the Victorian options as well. So it's a really good graphic to answer that specific question, that yes, these are big transmission projects, but I don't think Marinus is any different to any of the other major interconnectors that are currently under consideration. And it's really this access. If you can get access to that firming, you know, cost competitive firming, it makes a big difference to the end outcome in terms of technology cost stacks. And as I said, this isn't designed to replicate or replace a RIT-T. This is a very narrow sort of specific bit of analysis to answer a specific question. So don't, I guess I've had a couple of conversations with people about trying to sort of substitute this into a RIT-T assessment. A RIT-T actually assesses system-wide benefits, whereas this is not designed to do that. So, and as I said, in reality, you know, the market's going to need a lot more than 750 megawatts, and what you're effectively going to see is a mix of these options coming into the mix over the next 10 or 15 or 20 years. But a key point is if you inject the Tasmanian, if you can put in the Tasmanian contribution, you can actually get a better outcome in the end in terms of customer outcomes. Keep moving. Rightio, so I touched a little bit on this earlier on, and it's an important point to note. It's that there is a difference between what we might call shallow and deep storage, and look, there's not a distinct line between the two of them. But I think it is important to note that that when there's a lot of studies that have and publications that have come out around this idea that when you're early on in a transition to a renewable system, and you've still got a lot of, say, gas and coal, in terms of our example in Australia, your first need for storage is in that shallow storage range. So it's really that top bracket around brief variations in load and supply, contingency and events, and managing some of these transitional load uncertainty and supply constraints. So, and I think you're already seeing that in the Australian market. So, you're seeing a lot more batteries come into the market, whether they be distributed batteries or utility scale. And they're really targeting, in particular at the moment, those top two rows around sort of 0 to 2 hours. And I think I read somewhere the other day that there's plans for a 2-hour battery. Can't remember whether it was Victoria or New South Wales that are on the books for a development at the moment. So, and effectively that's what you're seeing. You're starting to see those shorter duration storages being needed now. And our view is, in terms of technology, batteries will be dominant in that space, whether they be distributed or whether they be utility scale, probably a combination of both. And I think that's what you're seeing in the market at the moment. But the further we get into this transition, and we're really looking, if we're going to go out sort of the back end of the 2020s and onwards past that, that storage requirement starts to increase dramatically. So you're starting to need what we would call deep storage, and those deep storages providing a different set of services in the market in terms of supplying security and reliability. So it's this deep storage where systems like our current hydropower system here in Tasmania, but also our pumped hydro sites, really start to come to the fore. So, we see that the market is going to start to need some of these deep storage options to come online if we're going to try and get to this point of having the best cost outcomes for customers overall. The challenge with deep storage is that it's quite hard to find. They're not, if you look at pumped hydro deep storage, and if you were to look at all the various pumped hydro sites that have been under assessment across Australia to date, the only deep storage assets that have either been under assessment or are being developed either exist in the Snowy scheme or here in Tasmania. So, I think it's a really, really interesting point where, it's not surprising in our view that you're seeing that sort of deep storage development occur in the two existing hydropower schemes, because, there was a reason why the hydropower schemes were built in those places in the first place, and they're the same reasons why you'd go looking for deep storage pumped hydro. So it's a key message we like to make sure we get out there and make it clear that, we see that there's a role for all technologies across the landscape in terms of supporting this transition. And, we see a very, very strong role for batteries in that shallow storage range, and noting shallow goes right up to sort of the 8-hour bracket. But if you really want a cost competitive system outcome for customers in supplying deep storage over that longer term, it's really projects like ours in Tasmania that become really important. This is a graph we've also released a few months back, and there's actually a call out on this issue in the ISP around the influence of imperfect foresight. So this is really around this concept that what most least cost modelling does, and that's what email have done, is they use perfect foresight in the modelling in terms of storage operations. But in reality, in real life, it doesn't actually work that way. So we've done a bit of analysis, and I guess from our perspective, this is something that we think a lot about, and we always have. And storage management is something that's close to our hearts and has been for a very, very long time. So we've done a fair bit of analysis around looking at the performance of shallow versus deep storage in markets. And when I say markets, it's really around an operator deciding when they choose to charge and discharge their assets. And, you know, all the analysis that we've done points to, at a system level, deep storage is a more efficient, has a more, when you factor in the role of imperfect foresight, deep storage can operate more closely to what you would call the theoretical operating through perfect foresight. And that's because you have more storage to play with. So effectively, the easiest way to look at it is if you've got a price event coming and you've got a 2-hour battery and you decide to take advantage of that price event and you discharge for your 2 hours, well, you effectively have decided to take that 2-hour opportunity as opposed to waiting for the next 2 hours. So you have that opportunity cost associated with discharging your battery. Deep storage sites, deep storage sites have a lot more flexibility in how you take advantage of those market opportunities. So, you know, a deep storage site, a pumped hydro site with 16 plus hours, for example, you can take advantage of that first 2 hours, but you still can take advantage of the next 2 hours or the next 2 hours after that if you want to. So what it means is you can operate those storages much more closely to what you would do if you were modeling perfect foresight. What that means from a system perspective is that the more deep storage you can have entering your system over the long term, the less storage you'll need overall. So, and it's a really, really important bit of analysis that I think is going to need a lot more work over the next few years in the markets. You know, I think AEMO understand this issue, but they're just calling it out in the ISP at the moment. And it wouldn't surprise me if it's not just us, but or AEMO, but there's probably a number of other institutions that would probably be wanting to look at this a bit more closely. And by the way, it's not just us that have this view. Energy Synapse released a study on the operation of the Hornsdale battery, I think early this year, I think it was, that effectively came to the same conclusion around the role of imperfect foresight. So I think it's a really important issue because I think storage as a technology and its role in the system, we're still very, very early on in I guess, the journey of understanding just how important it's going to be and how do we optimize it in terms of, you know, in inverted commas, a new service that may need to enter the market. Well, yeah, let's get into having a look at some of our sites. I'll focus next couple of slides on our pumped hydro sites. So we've been looking at 3 sites for probably about a year or so now. We started back in 2017 by doing a statewide scan, and we ended up, you know, you start from about 2,000 theoretical sites. We very, very quickly moved from 2,000 down to about 50 sites, and then we went down to about sort of 10 or 12. We've identified 6 sites in terms of long-term development, but we've been focusing on these 3 at the moment in terms of our feasibility. Now, we're looking to pick one of these 3 sites to line up with the second Marinus cable. So, you know, if the Marinus Link 2, you know, if you've got a possible commissioning date of, say, 2030, 2031, you know, that gives us a 10-year window to select one of these sites and get it ready such that it can enter the market at pretty much at the same time that the second cable would come online. Lake Sathana and Lake Rowallan, they're actually they're 2 sites in the Mersey Forth, which is the northwest of Tasmania. And that's an existing power scheme for us. So the Mersey Forth scheme was built sort of in the 1950s and 1960s. So there is already a power station at Sathana and Rowallan. And we'll have a look at those 2 sites in a second. The one on the right-hand side is over on the west coast. Lake Plimsoll is what you can see in the photo there. There's already a power station off the bottom of Lake Plimsoll called the Tribute Power Station as well, but it feeds into Lake Murchison. So we'll have a look at that site as well. So we'll be looking to select one of these 3 sites over the next couple of months, and we'll be making an announcement on which one we'll be focusing on in the next stage of development, which is pretty exciting for us. This is always a good sort of example pumped hydro arrangement. So this is what, if we were to develop a pumped hydro site at Rowallan or Sathana, this is what they would look like. So we would use the existing lakes, so Lake Sathana or Lake Rowallan, that are existing hydro lakes, and we would look to build an upper storage on one of the hills just adjacent to those lakes. So the Mersey Forth has got lots of pumped hydro development opportunities because it has existing deep lakes for our existing hydropower scheme. Those lakes are surrounded by really, really steep hills and flat tops. So you can get a relatively small horizontal displacement for a relatively large vertical displacement, which means you can get high head, high efficiency, quite large megawatt sizes of installations with relatively short tunnels. And we'll have a look at that in a little bit more detail. The one on the west coast is a bit different, and we'll have a look at that separately. It's actually utilising 2 existing reservoirs that we have in our scheme that has a conventional hydropower station there already. We would effectively build a pumped hydro site in parallel to the existing power station, and we'll have a look at the maps in a second. So this is the Sathana site. So the sort of slither of blue in the middle is the existing lake. It's a very deep lake. So, for example, there's a company that does diving training on this lake because I think it's the deepest inland lake, I think, in Australia. Effectively, you can see the thatched area where you've got an underground tunnel, and then there'd be an upper reservoir just to the west. So these are indicative maps too, by the way, so they're not exact sightings, but the process we're going through now is getting a much better view on more detailed siting planning at the moment. You see the tunnel length is about 3.5 kilometres. So relatively speaking, it's a short tunnel. And the cost per megawatt you can see is at the bottom end of what's going around in Australia at the moment in terms of pumped hydro. So we've put in 1.5 to 1.8 as being sort of, the band that we think that we'll need to stay within in terms of cost competitive construction. And Sathana sits at the bottom of that range. This is the one at Lake Rowan, which is just further up the valley. Effectively, water from Lake Rowan goes into Lake Parangana, and then that eventually makes its way down to Sathana, and then it goes into Barrington. That sort of trickles down at a cascading system. Effectively, it's the same sort of design as Sathana would be, looking for an upper reservoir sited just near an existing lake. It's important to note that the feasibility assessment we've done on all 3 of these sites, we've done quite a lot of detail around environmental, social, and heritage assessment. So any of the issues that we've highlighted, we think they're all very manageable in a normal project sort of planning and approvals process. So, for example, the land is either our land or it's Sustainable Timbers land. It's considered relatively low value because it's already been logged, that sort of stuff. And the social and the heritage considerations, we've got a pretty good handle on those because we operate in these places already. So, we're obviously already got a presence, so we have a good understanding of the issues that we would need to be managing. And once again, you can see the tunnel length is sub 3 kilometres for Rowan. Tribute's a bit different. So you can see Lake Plimsoll down the bottom of the screen. That's actually the upper reservoir on the west coast. And at the moment, there's a tunnel that actually goes from Plimsoll down to the Tribute power station, which is, I think, a 100 megawatt power station. And that water dumps into Lake Murchison, and then it makes its way further down our west coast scheme. Tribute was the last power station we built, by the way. So it was commissioned in about 1995. It's not well known that Hydro Tasmania or the Hydroelectric Commission, as it was known then, actually kept building hydropower schemes well into the 90s. So effectively would put a tunnel right next to the existing tunnel and put a new pumped hydro station in. Clearly, we saved costs on this site because we've got the 2 reservoirs that already exist, but you can see the tunnel's longer here because it's got to get between the 2 existing reservoirs. So you can see some of the cost and construction and sort of attributes that play off against each other with some of these projects. But and they're all, like, for the purposes of this conversation, they're all can be sized at 750 megawatts. We've actually got a number of different sizing options. We can actually flex that megawatt number, but we can also flex around the storage duration. So effectively, there's a 3-way playoff in terms of the detailed design for the site we take forward, and that's a playoff between what's the construction costs of the various elements of the projects compared to what sort of megawatts do we want to get out of the station compared to where we think the value of the storage duration is. So that's the sort of 3. They're the sort of 3 main issues that play off against each other in terms of, I guess, a more detailed spec for our final site. Rightio, I think I've done pretty well, actually. I've stayed on time, which is very unusual for me, Cam and Pippa, and would know very well. Look, it's a good point to sort of end here on this is effectively a contribution that Tasmania can make to what is essentially a national challenge. So it's important to note why we think that a contribution from Tasmania is important in terms of the wider response to what's ahead. When I've talked a bit about this point of deep storage. So, deep storage is hard to find. And whilst in the market of today, it doesn't figure as an important consideration, but we've really got to look further ahead than that. And I think that's what the ISP is doing a really good job at doing. And when you look far enough ahead into the future, if we've got deep storage assets either existing in terms of our current scheme, but also ones that can be developed in a cost competitive way and a sustainable way, we really need to be working out how do we unlock those opportunities. And effectively, that's the second point is there in terms of these storage assets that exist in Tasmania already. The interesting thing about Marinus Link as well is that it will result in increased competition both in Tasmania and Victoria. So, at the moment, Victoria's experiences constraints in terms of competition, in terms of dispatchable capacity. So, lots of new wind and solar coming into the system isn't going to necessarily help in that issue. What is important to drive best cost outcomes for customers, what we think is important is that you can actually increase competition in the end of dispatchable capacity. So Marinus Link does that a lot because it brings in Hydro Tasmania, who would play a much larger role in the Victorian market, and it would create more competition at that end of the curve. And we think there's some really big benefits in terms of end cost to customers by being able to increase competition in that part of the market. And look, I think that the work that TasNetworks have been doing, and that's now really been validated, I think, by AEMO, and is that this sort of investment, if it's timed correctly, has the effect of putting downward pressure on power prices, particularly in Victoria, but notably not just in Victoria. The effects of Marinus Link in terms of that downward pressure actually felt well into New South Wales and South Australia as well. So it's a really good point to finish on because we can talk about the Tasmanian development opportunities, but there's got to be a reason for it, and the market's got to want this sort of development. So it's a really important part of the conversation that we like to have. So that was the last slide, I think. It was. So that's Lake Plimsoll on the west coast. So that would be the upper reservoir on a pumped hydro site at Tribute if you were to build it. So and that's the Tyndall Ranges in the back of that really beautiful part of the world. But I'll probably stop there, Dylan. How's that sound? And
yeah, that sounds great.
And
thanks.
leave some time for questions.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, absolutely. So just a reminder for those who have submitted questions, I'll ask, it'd be great if you could unmute yourself and ask the questions live. If you're not comfortable doing that, I can also ask the questions on your behalf. But yeah, just let us know. First of all, I'd like to invite my colleague, actually, Professor Mike Sanderford, he's raised a couple of questions. I might, if you're happy to unmute yourself and ask those, Mike, I might get you to combine or ask them both at once, if that's possible. Not possible. How are we going there?
Okay.
Okay.
Good. Thanks very much, Chris. Enjoyed that very much. This question is just clearly the history of Basslink exposes some risk to long-term connection to Tasmania, which we'd all like to see. I'd just be interested in your comments on what we've learned from about subsea DC cables going forward.
Yeah. From a technical perspective, Mike, is that sort of more where that's coming from?
Well, it obviously plays into the risk profile that for the investment as well. So obviously that's founded in the technical risk.
Yeah. So it's a really good question. There's a couple of different elements to the response. Basslink as an undersea DC cable was sort of at the cutting edge of the technology at the time. So when it was put in, it was the longest undersea DC cable in the world. It was pretty out there in many respects. Since then, there's been a significant movement in that technology and the utilisation of it in power systems around the world. So lots and lots of DC interconnectors are in operation all over the world, or being planned to be put in operation. So I think from that perspective, there's that sort of maturation curve that comes along with the technology and its application in real life. The technology that underpins Marinus, and I won't get into this in too much detail, it's more probably a follow-up presentation maybe from someone like a Stephen Clark from Tas Networks, Dylan, who's all over this stuff. But the technology that underpins the converters and the cable itself now is much, much better than what it was for Basslink, just through the passage of time. It's much more sophisticated, much more reliable, and it can do a lot more as well. So it can actually provide a suite of services into the market, both in Tasmania and Victoria, that the current cable can't necessarily do. So really someone like a Stephen Clark from Tas Networks would be the ideal person to dig into that one. I think from a risk perspective, having more cables is redundancy. Therefore, I think it's good for system resilience as a whole. But I also think in terms of what's important about these projects is how they get developed as well in terms of the project structures. And I think that Basslink has been plagued by contractual issues as well, which I won't get into today. It's probably not a space for me to be commenting on. But look, I think I think the pathway that upon which Marinus tests is the right one. And I think the fact that it's been assessed as a portfolio of interconnectors across the whole market is a really, really important way, really important point to make. I'm a strong supporter of options assessment and development. And I think that the process AEMO are going through in developing a number of options to cover off a number of possible future scenarios, I think will leave us with a better outcome overall. When we get to that point when some of these interconnectors, and I'm not just talking about Marinus Link here, when these interconnectors are actually built.
Great, that
Thanks,
sounds good.
Chris. I might ask Jonathan Anderson next to unmute themselves.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yes, excellent.
Great. So thanks very much for a really interesting presentation. I'm an engineer at Arup, and I've worked on designs and business cases for pumped hydro projects. One of the key problems we have is the difficulty of making a business case stack up in the market that we're in, and particularly for, the deeper the storage goes. And I think there was another question that's sort of related to this one as well, around how often is it needed in the market. The deeper the storage is, the less often that, marginal additional capacity is needed. And so the less times per year you have in the market to make your CapEx back. So how do we design a market that works for the deep storage that's technically needed, but, economically kind of difficult to justify?
Yeah, and look, it's I'll be up front, John. I don't have the answer to that at this point in time. I think, we're very active participants in the market design process, the market review process at the moment. It's clearly, we understand this problem as well, that you can, at a system or a technology level, you can see the benefits for this sort of technology coming into the market, and we can even model it. So, our storage durations weren't just happenstance. We've done quite a lot of modelling in terms of how we think the system will work, particularly the southern end of the NEM. And we identified early that pumped hydro storage is sort of between 12 and 36 hours was really the sweet spot. And there was for two reasons. One, if you end up below the 12-hour threshold, you really start to expose yourself to the other competitor technologies in terms of cost curves. So we wanted to stay away from that space in terms of a valid investment in a pumped hydro site. But we also saw that storages that in between 12 and 36, and we've probably refined that even more now, we probably would say 14 to say 24 or 28 hours. We can see those sorts of assets cycling on a regular basis. So if you can so this is why I got back to this idea of optimizing your megawatts with your storage duration, with your construction costs. That is the magical triangle that we're working around now to really, fine tune some of the specs that we'd be looking at. But at the end of the day, somehow there's two elements to the market design process too. So there's the market design process that can make a clear, transparent framework or market that will incentivize the sort of storage we need. But there's also the commercial overlay that if you're a market player like us, and you think you've got a project that you can build and make money from, and then you have other counterparties that believe that they can come in on it and make money as well. you will see that overlay of commercial negotiations go on as well. So I think it's a really important topic, and I don't think we've got to the bottom of it yet. And we'll be watching and participating very closely in the ESB review process over the next couple of years.
Sounds good. Thanks,
Great.
Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Now we also have Professor Andrew Blake is on asking a question here too. For those of you that watch the space, you know, the professor's done a lot of work, so I'm sure you'll have a very interesting question. Over to you, Andrew.
Thank you. So Victoria has a very large number of pumped hydro opportunities, 99% of them off river, and they're not constrained by undersea cables. So really, how important would the deep storages in Tasmania be, given that your constraint really is the cable?
Yeah, our constraint is the cable, but probably the other point I'd note, and good to see you, Andrew, anyway. We haven't caught up for a little while in these COVID times. Andrew and I have bumped into each other in many pumped hydro conferences in the past. Look, the interconnection is obviously a constraint for battery of the nation, but I don't think we're alone in having constraints like that. So, you know, I think the ISP is the best place to have a look at the problem that we've got with our current transmission system and how it's going to service the new mix of technology. So, I think, and Marinus Link doesn't. The benefits for Marinus Link don't just rest solely on what Hydro Tasmania brings to the market. So, that's why it's important to note that the RIT-T is underway for Marinus Link, and that actually is there to understand the total costs and the total benefits of the interconnector. So it's just important to note that there's not a direct proportional sort of relationship between the two projects at that level. We think, so there's a couple of comments in terms of the Victorian pumped hydro stuff. So yeah, we've looked at a lot of the potential development opportunities in Victoria. Two observations. One, the storage durations is a really important thing. So, you know, a pumped hydro, our personal view is a pumped hydro development, if you're going to be sub 8 hours, it would want to be very, very cost competitive to build because of the technology curve costs for batteries, for example. So, you know, that's one of the reasons why we've stayed away from that bottom end of storage durations. So I think that's one of the key limiting factors I think we might find in terms of national pumped hydro development. The second issue I think also is that there's a theoretical view on pumped hydro development in the market, and then there's a commercial view. So, you know, we look at the market now, and there are less pumped hydro projects under development now than there were 3 years ago. So that tells you a number of things. It tells you that it's not easy, and it tells you that it's quite hard to find a site that you can actually practically develop and make a commercial return. And it's no surprise to us that you know, you can go from a theoretical view, a modelling view of how many pumped hydro resources you could develop in the country, but when you look at the actual developments, the actual projects that are going on in the market, there's only a very, very small number of them, and we're obviously one of the key players in that space. So our view is that, you know, would be targeting a late 2020s commissioning, and this is where it's not just about the resource, it becomes around the commercial opportunity. So, you know, we'd be looking at a late 2020s, early 2030s commissioning of our pumped hydro site. You know, we look at across what we think the market's going to do over that time period, not just in terms of pumped hydro, but other storage technologies, what we think gas is going to do. And we can see a really, really strong commercial opportunity for that project. And effectively, as a commercial organisation, if we can see a commercial opportunity that we think we can unlock, well, then, you know, we'll continue with our project. So I think you're starting to see the market response to this issue now. I think there are lots of physically possible pumped hydro sites across the country, and, you know, we've obviously had a close look at the stuff Andrew's done, and we've done versions of that ourselves. But when you come down to actual real sites where someone backs them and builds them because they've got a commercial model supporting them, I think it's going to be a lot harder than people think.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Chris. Next up, I might ask Ben Beattie to unmute himself. Someone else has also asked a similar question about the impacts of climate change as well, so I might just get Ben to ask it. Thanks. If you're there, Ben.
G'day, thanks Dylan, thanks Chris. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Excellent, great presentation, thank you. Yeah, my question relates to risk, and remembering in 2016 there was, there was some low hydro levels which limited the output from Tassie. I'm just interested in if, I suppose, around the lessons learnt from that, and has any of that made its way into the Battery of the Nation project in terms of what are the thresholds where you might prioritise local generation rather than exporting to Victoria, and how that all works?
Yep. It's a great question, Ben, and we get it all the time. So the answer is actually a little bit counterintuitive. The investment in more interconnection actually then stimulates more energy generation being developed, whether that be in Tasmania or Victoria or wherever else. The issues around storage management that you talk about in 2016, and there's been, that's happened on many occasions over our history. It's really around energy constraints. So effectively, we've largely had a system that's been mainly reliant on the hydropower system to keep the lights on. So the hydropower system and the energy system in Tasmania were almost one and the same thing. More interconnection actually brings more sources of new supply into the state, which effectively actually releases that constraint. So the future with more interconnection actually has a far more secure energy system in Tasmania than one without more interconnection. And it's because we're not relying on the hydropower system to keep the lights on all the time. We're actually going to be incentivized to hold storages because energy in storage and capacity becomes valuable. And it's actually going to leave us much, much better place to manage those variations in rainfall that we get. And acknowledging that in the future, all the modelling for the Tasmanian climate tends to suggest that we'll still get rainfall in Tasmania, but it's going to become much more unpredictable than it has been in the past. So having a power system in Tasmania that's not so closely connected to how much water you've got in storage is actually going to be a really, really a big step forward for us in terms of managing energy security in Tasmania. So our view is with more interconnection, you just won't see issues like you saw in 2016 happening again, because you've got redundancy in cables and you've also got a lot more new sources of energy available to the system when it's needed. Does that sort of answer the question, Ben?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I think it does. So basically, you've got a more diverse power supply with that level of interconnection. You're not just relying on rainfall and hydro.
Exactly right. Yeah, and it's that sharing of resources. It's that sharing of resources with the rest of the market has benefits for Victoria in particular, but also Tasmania. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Yeah, thanks Ben, and thanks Chris for that. We've come to the end of our allotted time for now. So yeah, we might call it to a close. I'd just like to draw your attention to our upcoming seminars. We've got one coming up next Wednesday on observed changes to flooding across Australia from Dr. Conrad Wasco. That's also same time, Wednesday next week. And the week after that, we have one on urban and transport planning pathways to carbon neutral and livable health cities from Professor Mark J. I'm not going to try and pronounce their last name. You can see it on our Google for Climate and College and Energy seminars to see upcoming seminars. Yeah, and that's it. Thanks again for attending today, and thanks for your great questions, and of course thanks to the folk from Hydro Tas to coming along and presenting their analysis and work on the Battery of the Nation project. Yeah, thanks very much.
Thanks, Dylan. It's been a pleasure.